Somewhere in the earliest drafts of Pokémon Red and Green, ideas flickered into existence before fading quietly back into development files. Invisible computers sat waiting in hotels that would never open their doors to guests, and Lapras existed not as a creature, but as a rental item trainers could carry in their bags. The first generation carried traces of decisions unmade, designs reconsidered, and creatures that wandered close to completion before turning back into concept sketches. And before we drift off tonight, feel free to subscribe so you never miss an upload, and tell me where you're watching from. And the quietest place to begin sits hidden in Celadon City's hotel, where something invisible still waits to be discovered. The Celadon Hotel stands as one of Kanto's most mysterious buildings, its doors accessible, but its purpose never fully realized in the final game. Inside the lobby, positioned where a front desk computer might logically sit, an invisible PC terminal remains programmed into the game's code, but stripped of its sprite and made inaccessible through normal play. Players walking through the hotel encounter nothing but empty space where this terminal once existed, yet the game still tracks its location in memory, a ghost of functionality that was meant to serve trainers checking in for rest. The invisible computer tells a story about Pokémon's earliest design philosophy, one where hotels functioned as rest stops similar to traditional role-playing games. In those early concepts, trainers would have needed to pay for rooms, save their progress at terminals in their rented spaces, and heal their teams through sleeping rather than visiting Nurse Joy at a Pokémon Center. This system mirrored games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, where inns served as essential recovery points scattered throughout the world. The decision to remove hotel functionality came late enough in development that the computers remained coded into specific buildings even after their purpose vanished. Celadon's hotel wasn't alone in this regard, as the Safari Zone's rest houses also contained invisible PC terminals that served no function in the released game. These rest houses, scattered throughout the Safari Zone's different areas, suggested a more complex vision for that location than what players eventually experienced. In early development builds, the Safari Zone might have functioned as a traditional wild area where trainers could battle and catch Pokémon using their own teams rather than the bait and rock system that made it to the final cut. The presence of rest houses with healing computers would have been necessary in such a design, allowing trainers to recover their Pokémon between encounters as they explored the zone's various sections. This would explain why multiple rest houses existed despite the final Safari Zone lasting only 500 steps before automatically ejecting the player. The invisible computers raise questions about what else was removed from these locations during the final development push. Celadon's hotel, in particular, feels like an incomplete space, with multiple floors containing nothing but empty rooms and a single NPC who offers cryptic dialogue. The building's size suggests it was meant to serve a greater purpose than simply existing as decoration in the city's landscape, yet its role was stripped away before release. Rest houses within the Safari Zone present another layer of curiosity, as their placement suggests careful thought about an exploration flow. Each rest house sits at a point where players might logically need to heal or save, positioned near zone transitions or in the middle of areas with particularly rare Pokémon encounters. This deliberate spacing implies that Safari Zone exploration was once envisioned as a longer, more demanding experience than the time-limited minigame it became. The shift away from hotel-based healing to Pokémon centers likely came from a desire to streamline the player experience and remove gold as a resource barrier for recovery. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Hotels charging money for rest would have created situations where players ran out of funds and couldn't heal, forcing them to grind for money or carefully manage resources in ways that might frustrate younger audiences. Pokémon centers offering free healing removed this potential frustration while still maintaining the feeling of traveling through a world with infrastructure supporting trainers on their journeys. The invisible computers remain accessible through glitches and boundary-breaking techniques, allowing dedicated players to interact with these phantom terminals decades after release. When accessed, they function identically to any other PC in the game, opening the standard menu for Pokémon storage, item management, and Professor Oak's Pokédex evaluation. This functionality being intact confirms these weren't merely decorative elements that were removed, but fully programmed features that simply had their visibility disabled. Another quiet detail emerges when examining how the invisible computer mechanic relates to the game's overall design philosophy during development. Early Pokémon games borrowed heavily from traditional Japanese RPGs, which commonly featured inns, shops, and service centers scattered throughout their worlds. The developers' decision to consolidate these functions into Pokémon centers represented a unique approach that streamlined gameplay while maintaining the feeling of infrastructure supporting the player's journey. The Lapras item exists deep within Pokémon Red and Green's code as one of the most fascinating pieces of cut content, a key item that would have functioned similar to the bicycle but for water navigation. This item, coded with a bicycle-like icon and labeled internally as the Lapras tool, would have allowed players to surf across water routes without needing to teach the HM move to any Pokémon in their party or earn the Soul Badge from Fuchsia City's gym. Having a Lapras item as a rental or purchasable tool creates an interesting contrast with the Pokémon's final role as a rare creature gifted to players by a Sylph Company employee. In its item form, Lapras would have been accessible to any trainer with enough money to rent or buy one, transforming it from a special encounter into a commonly available service similar to bicycle rental in Cerulean City. The Pokédex entry for Lapras in the final game states that the species was hunted nearly to extinction by humans, making the existence of a Lapras item darkly ironic in retrospect. If Lapras had remained a rental item rather than becoming a Pokémon, the species would have been farmed and bred specifically for commercial use, with rental shops maintaining stables of these creatures for trainers to borrow during their water travels. Early item lists from development builds show the Lapras item positioned near other travel tools like the bicycle and coin case, suggesting it was meant to be obtained through similar means. Players might have received a Lapras voucher from an NPC or purchased the item directly from a shop in a coastal city, with the tool becoming available midway through the adventure to open up water-based exploration. The transition from Lapras item to Lapras Pokémon likely came from a desire to make every HM feel important and to add more rare Pokémon encounters to the game's progression. Surf became one of the most essential HM moves in Kanto's design, required to access numerous routes, cities, and dungeons that would otherwise remain locked off. Making Surf available through an item would have significantly altered the game's exploration flow and reduced the importance of HM moves as gating mechanics. The Sylph Company employee who gifts Lapras in the final game might have originally been the source of the Lapras item, with dialogue and encounter design repurposed when the item became a Pokémon. This NPC appears in Sylph Company's 7th floor after Team Rocket is defeated, thanking the player for saving the company and offering Lapras as a reward. The gratitude and presentation feel appropriate for either giving away a valuable item or entrusting the player with a rare Pokémon. Interestingly, The concept of rental or purchasable transportation items did eventually appear in later Pokémon generations, though never quite in the way the Lapras item would have functioned. Bicycle shops became a series staple, but water transportation remained tied to Pokémon and ancient moves through the first 4 generations, only changing when hidden machines themselves were replaced with different systems in later games. The Lapras item's removal also raises questions about what other transportation items might have existed in early builds. If Lapras was meant to replace Surf as an HM, were there similar items planned for Fly, Cut, or Strength? Development notes and unused item slots suggest other field move items may have been conceptualized, though none remain as clearly defined in the game's code as the Lapras tool. Some fan theories suggest the Lapras item might have been accessible earlier in the game than HM03 Surf typically becomes available, potentially allowing players to reach Cinnabar Island or explore water routes before defeating Koga and earning the Soul Badge. This would have created interesting sequence-breaking opportunities and allowed for more non-linear exploration of Kanto's later areas, though it also might have caused progression problems if players reached locations before they were ready for the challenges there. The item's icon, visible in certain debugging modes and prototype builds, shows a simple representation of Lapras similar to how the bicycle icon depicts a basic bicycle shape. This minimalist approach to key item icons was standard for the Game Boy's limited graphics capabilities, but it also made items feel functional rather than decorative, emphasizing their utility as tools rather than prizes to be collected. Another layer of intrigue surrounds whether the Lapras item would have had any restrictions on where it could be used. The bicycle cannot be ridden indoors or in certain outdoor areas, raising the question of whether the Lapras item would have similar limitations. Could players summon Lapras in any body of water, or would it only function on designated surf routes? These details remain lost to development decisions made decades ago. The HM moves introduced in Pokémon Red and Green served dual purposes, functioning as attacks in battle, while also enabling field navigation and puzzle solving. This design philosophy required players to carefully consider their team composition, as HM moves were difficult to delete and often not particularly powerful in competitive battles. Several HM-related mechanics underwent significant changes during development, with some moves being adjusted or entirely replaced before the games reached players. Flash existed in the game's code long before its final implementation was solidified, with early builds treating it as a required field move, similar to Surf or Cut, rather than an optional tool for illuminating dark caves. Rock Tunnel, the primary location where Flash proves useful, was originally designed to be completely impassable without the move, featuring absolute darkness that prevented players from navigating even a single step without using Flash first. Development notes reveal that this stricter darkness implementation was softened after playtesters expressed frustration at being forced to catch a Pokémon capable of learning Flash and then navigate to the move tutor before they could progress through Rock Tunnel. The final version allows players to stumble through the darkness if they memorize the path or draw maps, turning Flash into a convenience rather than a hard requirement. Another HM that underwent substantial changes was Cut, which originally required significantly more usage throughout Kanto than in the final game. Early route designs featured small trees blocking paths in nearly every location, forcing players to constantly use Cut to progress. This proved tedious during playtesting, leading designers to reduce the number of cuttable trees to only those blocking access to optional areas or serving as major progression gates. The decision to make most cuttable trees optional rather than mandatory reflects a broader design philosophy change that occurred during development. Early Pokémon games were conceived as more traditional RPGs, with puzzles and obstacles blocking progression at regular intervals, but feedback from younger playtesters indicated that too many obstacles created frustration rather than satisfying puzzle-solving moments. Strength underwent perhaps the most significant mechanical changes of any AHM move during development. In early builds, strength could only be used to push boulders in a single direction, and if a boulder was pushed into a corner or against a wall incorrectly, the puzzle would become unsolvable, forcing players to leave the area and return to reset boulder positions. This harsh puzzle design was eventually softened to allow boulders to be pulled as well as pushed, though pulling was still restricted in ways that prevented complete freedom of movement. The caves and dungeons requiring strength were designed around these more restrictive boulder mechanics, with the early versions of Victory Road and Seafoam Islands featuring significantly more complex boulder puzzles that could trap players if solved incorrectly. Playtest feedback indicated these puzzles were too punishing, particularly for younger players who became stuck and couldn't progress without completely restarting their exploration of these areas. Fly, perhaps the most convenient HM for long-distance travel, was nearly removed from the game entirely during a mid-development redesign that questioned whether instant fast travel fit Pokemon's exploration-focused gameplay. Designers worried that allowing players to instantly return to any previously visited city would reduce the sense of journey and make Kanto feel smaller than intended. The compromise that saved Fly involved restricting it to outdoor use only and requiring players to obtain it relatively late in their adventure after visiting most of Kanto's major locations. By the time players received HM02 from the woman west of Celadon City, they had already explored most routes and cities on foot, ensuring they experienced the world's geography and landmarks before gaining the convenience of instant travel. Surf, as mentioned earlier, existed alongside the Lapras item in very early builds, with designers uncertain whether water navigation should require a move or a tool. The decision to make it an HM rather than relying on an item meant that Surf needed to be useful in battle, as well as exploration, leading to its implementation as a moderately powerful water-type attack that many water Pokémon could learn. The badge requirement system for using HM moves outside of battle was added relatively late in development as a progression gate to prevent players from accessing late-game areas too early. Initially, HM moves could be used immediately after learning them, but this created sequence-breaking opportunities that allowed players to reach Cinnabar Island or the power plant long before the designers intended, potentially encountering high-level wild Pokémon before they were properly prepared. One cut HM that appears in early item lists is Teleport, which would have functioned as a field move, allowing instant return to the last Pokémon Center visited. This was eventually removed, and Teleport became only a battle move, with limited field functionality through Abra's unique use of the move outside of combat. The decision to cut Teleport as an HM might have come from concerns about players using it to escape difficult situations or dungeons they were meant to complete. Another removed field move was the Earthquake, which the early design documents suggest would have allowed players to cause tremors that cleared rockslide debris or opened new paths and caves. This mechanic was likely cut due to concerns about the complexity it would add to dungeon design and the potential for players to become confused about where Earthquake could and should be used. The HM system itself was controversial even within Game Freak during development, with some designers arguing that forcing players to dedicate move slots to field moves reduced strategic options and punished players who wanted to optimize their teams for battle. This debate continued through multiple generations until HMs were eventually replaced with different systems in later games, but for Kanto's original design, they remained a core part of the exploration experience. Whirlpool was another cut HM that appears in early development notes, though it wouldn't be officially implemented until Generation 2's Johto region. In these early Kanto designs, Whirlpool would have functioned similarly to how it appeared in Gold and Silver, allowing players to traverse swirling water obstacles that blocked certain routes. The removal of this HM from Generation 1 might have come from concerns about having too many water-based field moves, or from the decision that Kanto's geography didn't require this additional navigation tool. TM compatibility underwent massive changes during Pokémon Red and Green's development, with many Pokémon learning different technical machines in early builds compared to what made it to the final release. These changes often reflected shifts in how the developers understood each Pokémon's strengths, weaknesses, and thematic identity, with some compatibility additions or removals significantly altering competitive viability. Clefable originally learned Submission and Seismic Toss in early builds, giving the Fairy-type Pokémon surprisingly strong Fighting-type coverage that made it more viable against Normal and Rock-type opponents. These moves were removed from Clefable's TM compatibility list during the late-stage balancing, with developers deciding that Clefable's moveset should emphasize its magical, fairy-like nature rather than physical combat techniques. Alakazam could learn several elemental punch TMs in early versions, including Fire Punch, Ice Punch, and Thunder Punch, despite its design and concept suggesting a focus on purely psychic abilities. This broader move pool made Alakazam even more dominant than it already was, as it could counter its few weaknesses with super effective coverage moves. The removal of these punches from Alakazam's TM compatibility was a balancing decision meant to give other Pokémon opportunities to counter the psychic powerhouse. Gyarados' TM list underwent several revisions, with early builds allowing it to learn Dragon Rage, Dragon Claw, and several other Dragon-type moves despite not actually being a Dragon-type Pokémon. These moves were removed during type balancing passes when developers realized that Gyarados was already too strong with its water and flying typing and didn't need additional dragon coverage. Meowth and Persian originally learned significantly fewer TMs in early builds, with their move pools expanding during development to make them more viable as team members rather than just being early route Pokémon that most players boxed after catching something stronger. The addition of moves like Thunderbolt, Bubble Beam, and Shadow Ball to their TM compatibility helped Persian remain relevant in late-game battles. Oddish, Gloom, and Vileplume had their TM lists adjusted multiple times during development, with early versions learning significantly fewer Grass-type TMs and more Poison-type TMs than the final release. This shift reflected changing understanding of how to balance dual-type Pokémon and ensure that each typing felt represented in their move pools. Poliwrath's compatibility with Fighting-type TMs was added relatively late in development, after designers realized the Pokémon's design and concept strongly suggested martial arts expertise that wasn't reflected in its available moves. The addition of Submission, Seismic Toss, and other fighting moves helped Poliwrath feel like a true fighting type, rather than just a water Pokémon with fighting added as a secondary type. Electrode originally learned significantly fewer electric-type TMs than the final version, with its early move pool focusing almost entirely on explosion-based moves and self-destructive tactics. The expansion of its electric-type TM compatibility made Electrode more versatile and less of a one-trick Pokémon that existed only to explode on opponents. The legendary Bird Trio underwent TM compatibility adjustments that ensured each bird felt unique rather than having identical move pools. Early builds gave all three birds access to the same TMs, but late-stage revisions restricted certain moves to specific birds to emphasize their individual identities and ensure players felt rewarded for catching all three rather than just picking their favorite. Eevee's evolutions received significant TM compatibility expansions during development, with early builds giving them much more limited move pools that didn't fully utilize their respective types. Vaporeon's ability to learn Ice Beam, Jolteon's access to Thunderbolt, and Flareon's compatibility with Fire Blast were all added during balancing passes that aimed to make the evolutions competitively viable. Dragonite's TM list was carefully curated during late development to ensure it could function as a versatile sweeper without becoming completely unstoppable. Early builds gave Dragonite access to nearly every offensive TM in the game, making it far too powerful compared to other Pokémon. The final TM compatibility list represents a compromise between making Dragonite feel legendary and maintaining competitive balance. Several Pokémon had their TM compatibility restricted during late-stage balancing after playtesters demonstrated game-breaking strategies that exploited certain move combinations. Chansey's ability to learn nearly every special attack TM was reduced, Snorlax's access to certain setup moves was removed, and Tauros's already powerful moveset was prevented from expanding further. The cut Pokémon from Generation 1's development represent some of the most fascinating glimpses into what Kanto could have been, with dozens of creatures designed, sprited, and partially programmed before being removed or drastically redesigned. These Pokémon range from simple concept sketches that never advanced beyond basic drawings to fully functional creatures with stats, moves, and evolution methods implemented in code. Gorochu stands as perhaps the most famous cut Pokémon from Generation 1, an evolution of Raichu that would have completed the Pikachu line as a three-stage evolution similar to the starter Pokémon. Gorochu's design featured prominent fangs, or horns, darker coloration than Raichu, and a more aggressive appearance that matched the pattern of starter final evolutions becoming larger and more intimidating. The name Gorochu derives from the Japanese onomatopoeia for thunder, Goro Goro, which fits perfectly with the evolutionary naming scheme established by Pikachu and Raichu. Pika represents the sound of electricity crackling, Rai means thunder or lightning, and Goro specifically refers to the deep rumbling sound of thunder, suggesting that Gorochu would have been even more powerful and imposing than its pre-evolution. Development notes indicate that Gorochu was cut primarily due to balance concerns and cartridge space limitations rather than design problems. Game Freak's designers liked Gorochu's appearance and concept, but giving Pikachu a three-stage evolution would have made it significantly stronger than other electric-type Pokémon and potentially overshadowed creatures like Electabuzz and Magneton that were meant to fill different niches. The decision to cut Gorochu gained additional significance years later when Pikachu became the franchise's mascot through the anime's popularity. Had Gorochu remained in the game, the anime might have faced pressure to evolve Ash's Pikachu twice, rather than keeping it in its base form, potentially changing one of the series' most iconic character decisions. Balloona represents another fascinating cut, Pokémon, a balloon-themed creature that existed in sprite form, with both front and back sprites completed before being removed from the final game. The back sprite shows a simple balloon shape, while early design sketches reveal a front view featuring a cute, Kirby-like face that would have made Balloona instantly appealing to players seeking adorable Pokémon. The existence of Balloona in partially complete form suggests it was cut relatively late in development, after significant work had been invested in its creation. This late-stage removal might have come from concerns that Balloona was too similar to Jigglypuff, another balloon-like Pokémon that already filled the cute round pink Pokémon niche in Generation 1's roster. Another reason for Balluna's removal might have been uncertainty about its typing and evolution. Early notes suggest it might have been normal type, or possibly flying type, but neither option felt particularly distinctive or interesting compared to other Pokémon already in the game. Without a clear identity or niche, Balluna became expendable when cartridge space limitations forced developers to cut some creatures. The Kotora line represents one of the most developed cut evolutionary families from Generation 1, consisting of 3 tiger-themed Pokémon that progressed from a cute cub to an imposing adult tiger. Sprite work for all 3 stages was partially completed, and the line was even reconsidered for inclusion in Generation 2 before ultimately being cut again. Kotora, the first stage, resembled a small tiger cub with electric markings, suggesting an electric type designation that would have given Kanto another electric evolutionary line alongside Pikachu. The middle evolution, Raitora, maintained the tiger theme while growing larger and more aggressive. Kotora, the final evolution, would have been a fully grown tiger with prominent lightning bolt stripes and an intimidating stance. Game Freak's persistent attempts to include the Kotora line across 2 generations indicates the designers had strong attachment to these Pokémon, likely because tiger-themed creatures are popular in Japanese culture and would have provided an alternative to the rodent-based Pikachu line. The repeated cuts suggest that balance concerns or typing conflicts prevented the line from fitting smoothly into either generation's roster. One theory about why the Kotora line was ultimately abandoned involves the addition of Raikou to Generation 2's legendary beast trio. Raikou is essentially an electric tiger, potentially filling the same thematic space that Kotora would have occupied. Rather than having both a regular electric tiger line and a legendary electric tiger, the developers might have decided that one was sufficient. The unnamed Psyduck middle evolution represents one of the more mysterious cut Pokémon, as it exists primarily in internal evolution data rather than as completed sprites. Code analysis reveals that Psyduck was originally meant to evolve into this unnamed middle stage at level 22, which would then evolve into Golduck at level 33, creating a 3-stage water-type line. The decision to remove this middle evolution and allow Psyduck to evolve directly into Golduck at level 33 streamlined the line while also addressing concerns that Golduck didn't look like an evolution of Psyduck. The middle stage might have been designed to bridge the visual gap between Psyduck's duck-like appearance and Golduck's more streamlined, platypus-inspired design. Without sprites or detailed descriptions, speculation about this middle evolution's appearance relies on extrapolating from Psyduck and Golduck's designs. It likely would have retained Psyduck's yellow coloration while beginning to show some of Golduck's sleeker features, perhaps featuring a body shape halfway between the two, with partial development of Golduck's distinctive forehead gem. The removal of this middle evolution also affected the Psyduck line's balance, as jumping from a relatively weak first-stage Pokémon directly to a fully evolved form created a significant power spike that made Golduck feel more impactful when it finally evolved. A middle stage would have spread this power growth more gradually, which might have made the line feel less dramatic. Omega, a Pokémon clearly inspired by the Greek letter and possibly representing a counterpart to an alpha Pokémon that was also cut, appears in early Pokédex lists but has no surviving sprite data or detailed design information. The name suggests it was meant to be a late game or final Pokémon, possibly even a legendary creature that represented endings or completion. Speculation about Omega's design and typing ranges widely in the Pokémon fan community, with theories suggesting everything from a psychic-type legendary to a normal-type pseudo-legendary similar to Dragonite. The lack of concrete information means Omega remains one of the most mysterious cut Pokémon, existing only as a name in development files, without clear purpose or appearance. Several cut pre-evolutions from Generation 1 eventually inspired baby Pokémon that were added in Generation 2, creating an interesting legacy for designs that never appeared in their original form. These cut pre-evolutions include early concepts for Vulpix, Meowth, Ponyta, and Goldeen pre-evolved forms that would have expanded their evolutionary lines. The Vulpix pre-evolution, internally named Kanya in some development documents, would have been a fox puppy with fewer tails than Vulpix's 6. This design eventually influenced Vulpix's portrayal in various Pokémon media as being born with a single white tail that splits into 6 as it matures, preserving the concept even though the actual pre-evolution was never implemented. Meowth's cut pre-evolution appears to have inspired Skitty in Generation 3, though whether this was intentional homage or coincidental design similarity remains unclear. The cut design featured an even more kitten-like appearance than Meowth, emphasizing cuteness over the mischievous personality that defined Meowth in the final game. The Ponyta pre-evolution would have been a small foal with flames that were just beginning to develop, possibly not even strong enough to support a rider. This concept of flame development, tied to maturity, appeared in various Pokédex entries for Ponyta and Rapidash, suggesting the idea influenced the line's lore even after the pre-evolution itself was cut. Goldeen's pre-evolution, nicknamed Gyopi in some fan communities due to fragmented code references, would have been a tiny goldfish Pokémon that evolved into Goldeen at relatively low levels. The decision to cut this pre-evolution might have come from concerns that it would be too weak to be useful and that the Goldeen line didn't need a baby form to feel complete. Godzilla-inspired Pokémon appear several times in cut content from Generation 1, with at least 2 different kaiju-style creatures being designed and partially implemented before removal. Gion, one of these cut Pokémon, featured a design clearly inspired by Godzilla itself, with a stocky reptilian body, prominent dorsal, plates, and an aggressive stance. The decision to cut Gion likely came from concerns about copyright infringement, as Godzilla is an extremely well-protected intellectual property in Japan. While Pokémon designs often draw inspiration from real animals, mythology, and pop culture, creating a Pokémon that too closely resembled an iconic movie monster posed legal risks that Game Freak wasn't willing to take. Tyranitar in Generation 2 eventually filled the Godzilla-inspired Pokémon niche, but with enough design differences to avoid legal concerns while still capturing the essence of a giant, destructive monster. The existence of Gion in Generation 1's development suggests that the desire to include a Godzilla-like Pokémon was present from the beginning, requiring multiple attempts before finding a design that worked legally and thematically. Another cut kaiju Pokémon, lacking a confirmed name in development files, appeared to be inspired by Ultraman or other tokusatsu heroes rather than giant monsters, featuring a more heroic stance and color scheme. This Pokémon's removal might have been due to similar copyright concerns or simply because it didn't fit Kanto's roster thematically. The Lizard Evolutionary line, consisting of 3 stages, represents another set of cut Pokémon that reached relatively advanced development before being removed. These 3 lizard-like creatures clearly formed an evolutionary family, with each stage growing larger and more detailed, but the specific type of lizard they represented remains unclear from surviving sprite data. Some fan analysis suggests these were meant to be gecko or chameleon Pokémon, possibly with color-changing abilities, or camouflage themes that would have made them unique among Generation 1's roster. Others argue the designs more closely resemble monitor lizards or iguanas, which would have made them similar to the Charmander line, but without the fire typing. The removal of this lizard line might have come from its similarity to existing Pokémon, or from concerns that it didn't have a distinctive enough gimmick to stand out among Generation 1's diverse roster. With Charmander already filling the lizard-like starter niche and several other reptilian Pokémon like Scyther and Aerodactyl providing variety, another generic lizard line might have felt redundant. Bew, the cut Ice-type Pokémon meant to serve as a counterpart to Electabuzz and Magmar, represents one of the most significant lost opportunities from Generation 1's development. Designed as a Yeti or abominable snowman, Bew would have completed the elemental humanoid trio that currently feels incomplete, with only fire and electric types represented. Bew's design featured white fur, a large imposing body similar to Electabuzz and Magmar's proportions, and possibly clawed hands that emphasized its wild, mountainous nature. As an ice type, Bew would have provided another powerful ice Pokémon in a generation where ice types were relatively rare and mostly limited to water-ice dual types like Lapras and Dugong. The decision to cut Bew becomes even more puzzling when considering that Jynx existed as an ice type in the same development builds where Bew appeared, suggesting that Bew wasn't cut to avoid type overlap, but for other reasons. One theory suggests Bew was removed because its design was too similar to existing Yeti depictions in other media, raising concerns about originality, similar to what happened with the Godzilla-inspired Pokémon. Another possibility is that Bew's ice typing created balance issues in Kanto's gym lineup, as an ice type would have been extremely effective against both Lance's dragon types and Lorelei's ice types, potentially making it too centrally powerful in the Elite Four battles. Without Bew, players needed to carefully strategize their ice type coverage, rather than having a convenient humanoid ice Pokémon that matched Electabuzz and Magmar's strength. The existence of Jynx alongside Bew in early builds raises questions about whether one was meant to replace the other, or if both were initially planned for inclusion. Jynx's more unique humanoid design, with its dress-like body and distinctive appearance, might have won out over Bew's more straightforward Yeti concept, leading to Bew's removal. Years later, Generation 4 introduced Mamoswine as a mammoth-themed ice type, and Generation 5 added Beartic as a polar bear ice type, suggesting that the desire for a large, imposing, pure ice type continued to influence Pokémon design across multiple generations even after Bew was cut. An elephant Pokémon appears in early design sketches, standing upright on two legs with a relatively simple design that suggests it was conceived early in development before being abandoned. This bipedal elephant would have been one of Generation 1's few large, normal-type Pokémon, potentially filling a niche similar to Kangaskhan or Tauros as a strong but straightforward physical attacker. The decision to cut this elephant Pokémon might have come from its design being too generic, as a simple standing elephant doesn't immediately suggest interesting battle mechanics or a unique type combination. Donphin in Generation 2 eventually provided a ground-type elephant Pokémon with a more distinctive rolling attack pattern, showing how the concept evolved over time. A cactus Pokémon with an angry expression appears in similar early sketches, suggesting a grass type with a spiky, aggressive personality. This design might have been an early concept that eventually evolved into Cacnea and Cacturn in Generation 3, or it might have been cut entirely for lacking distinction among Generation 1's grass types. A deer Pokémon, literally named Deer, appears in internal files, representing perhaps the most straightforwardly named cut Pokémon from early development. This normal-type deer would have been one of several forest-themed Pokémon in Kanto, possibly appearing in Viridian Forest or along routes connecting to Pallet Town. The simplicity of naming this Pokémon just deer suggests it was a placeholder design created very early in development, before the team established stronger naming conventions that tied Pokémon names to puns, onomatopoeia, or characteristic features. The final game's more creative names like Deerling and Sawsbuck in later generations show how far Pokémon naming evolved from these early, literal approaches. Other generic cut Pokémon from early design phases include a basic bird that was distinct from Pidgey, a simple cat separate from Meowth, and a plain dog that wasn't Growlithe, suggesting that Game Freak initially planned for more variety among common animal-inspired Pokémon before consolidating to avoid redundancy. These generic designs being cut reflects an important development philosophy that emerged during Generation 1's creation. Every Pokémon should have something distinctive about its design, typing, or concept rather than being just a straightforward representation of a real animal. This philosophy pushed designers to add elements like Psyduck's headache, Slowpoke's delayed reactions, and Cubone's skull helmet, transforming generic concepts into memorable creatures. Wartortle originally had a different final evolution than Blastoise, with design sketches showing a more straightforward aquatic turtle that lacked Blastoise's distinctive shoulder cannons. This alternate Wartortle evolution maintained closer visual continuity with the earlier stages of the Evolutionary line, featuring a more naturalistic turtle design with perhaps enhanced shell plating but no mechanical or weapon-like elements. Blastoise itself was originally designed as the final evolution of a completely different turtle Pokémon line that was cut from the game, leaving Blastoise orphaned until designers decided to attach it to the Squirtle line instead. This explains the dramatic visual discontinuity between Squirtle and Wartortle's designs compared to Blastoise's more armored, cannon-equipped appearance. The shoulder cannons that defined Blastoise's design were reportedly a late addition that came from wanting the final water starter evolution to feel more impressive and powerful. Early Blastoise designs lacked these cannons entirely, featuring instead larger fins or shells that emphasized defensive capabilities over offensive weaponry. This design history explains why Blastoise often feels visually disconnected from its pre-evolutions, as it literally came from a different evolutionary family before being grafted onto the Squirtle line during late-stage development. The decision was likely made to save cartridge space by reducing the number of unique Pokémon while ensuring each starter had a complete 3-stage evolution. Marowak had a final evolution cut from Generation 1, featuring a design that made it look remarkably similar to Kangaskhan carrying a baby in its pouch. This Marowak evolution would have stood upright, carried a larger bone weapon, and notably featured a smaller Cubone-like offspring in a pouch or being carried on its back, explicitly connecting the Cubone line to themes of parenting and family. The visual similarity between this cut Marowak evolution and Kangaskhan has fueled decades of fan theories suggesting that Kangaskhan was originally meant to be part of the Cubone evolutionary family. These theories propose that Cubone is an orphaned baby Kangaskhan wearing its mother's skull, and that Marowak represents a Cubone that grew up without becoming a full Kangaskhan. Whether these theories are true or simply coincidental, design similarities remains unclear, but the existence of a cut Marowak evolution that explicitly featured a parent and child design strongly suggests that Game Freak was exploring family-themed evolutions during development. The decision to cut this evolution might have come from concerns about the dark implications of Cubone's backstory becoming even more explicit. The baby Marowak was carrying in the cut evolution's design would have raised uncomfortable questions about the Cubone line's reproduction and life cycle, as it would confirm that Marowak actively produces offspring that then lose their mothers and become Cubone. This cycle of guaranteed orphaning would be unusually dark for a game meant to appeal to children, possibly contributing to the evolution's removal. Pre-evolution, Pokémon underwent significant conceptual development during Generation 1's creation, with many existing Pokémon originally planned to have earlier stages that were cut before release. These cut pre-evolutions eventually inspired the baby Pokémon mechanic introduced in Generation 2, which added creatures like Pichu, Cleffa, and Igglybuff as earlier stages of existing evolutionary lines. The Vulpix pre-evolution, partially visible in early design sketches, would have hatched from eggs with a single tail that would split into multiple tails as it grew into Vulpix. This concept of tails multiplying through evolution ties into Japanese kitsune mythology, where fox spirits gain additional tails as they age and become more powerful. The decision to cut this pre-evolution from Generation 1 likely came from balance concerns, as adding earlier stages to already weak Pokémon would have made the early forms nearly unusable in battle. Later generations solved this problem through breeding mechanics and friendship evolution, allowing baby Pokémon to exist without forcing players to use them in combat. Meowth's cut pre-evolution appears in fragmentary sprite data, showing an even smaller, more kitten-like Pokémon than Meowth itself. This pre-evolution might have been called Mewth or Nico in early development, though these names remain unconfirmed speculation based on file analysis and interviews with early developers. The pattern of cut pre-evolutions suggests that Game Freak experimented extensively with evolutionary complexity during development before deciding that 3-stage lines were sufficient for most Pokémon. The few 4-stage lines that remain, like Slowpoke's branch evolution into Slowking, represent exceptions rather than the standard approach. Ponyta's pre-evolution design emphasized the development of fire across the evolutionary stages, with the baby form potentially featuring flames that only appear as small flickering embers rather than the flowing mane present on Ponyta. This gradual fire development concept appears in Ponyta's Pokédex entries, which describe the flames growing stronger as the Pokémon ages. The goldfish pre-evolution for Goldeen would have been among the game's earliest available Pokémon, possibly appearing through fishing with the old rod before players even received the good or super rod. This early availability would have made it the equivalent of Generation 2's Magikarp, requiring significant training before evolving into anything useful. Cutting these pre-evolutions streamlined Generation 1's Pokédex and avoided situations where players felt forced to carry weak baby Pokémon just to eventually obtain the creatures they actually wanted. The breeding mechanic, introduced in Generation 2, eventually allowed these concepts to be revisited in a way that made more sense for gameplay flow. Another impact of cutting pre-evolutions was allowing evolved Pokémon to be found in the wild more easily, as there was no concern about skipping earlier stages. Pokémon like Ponyta, Vulpix, and Goldeen could all be encountered directly, rather than requiring players to breed or evolve them from weaker forms. The Gorochu situation represents perhaps the most discussed cut evolution from Generation 1, with the third Pikachu family member remaining a topic of speculation and interest decades after its removal. Design sketches that surfaced years after Red and Green's release confirmed Gorochu's appearance, showing a stocky, aggressive electric type with prominent fangs and a darker color scheme than Raichu. Gorochu would have evolved from Raichu at level 50, giving the Pikachu line extremely late-game power that would have made it comparable to pseudo-legendary Pokémon like Dragonite. This high evolution level suggests Gorochu was intended to be significantly more powerful than most fully evolved Pokémon, potentially matching or exceeding the strength of some legendary Pokémon. The removal of Gorochu was reportedly a difficult decision, with lead designer Satoshi Tajiri personally fond of the design, but convinced by programming staff that the cartridge couldn't accommodate the additional Pokémon without cutting others that were more essential to Kanto's roster. Choosing between Gorochu and other Pokémon that filled unique type niches meant Gorochu, which was just another electric type, became expendable despite its connection to Pikachu. Another factor in Gorochu's removal was balance testing revealing that a 3-stage Pikachu line significantly outperformed other electric types like Electabuzz, Magneton, and Electrode when all were fully evolved. Since electric types were already among the strongest types in Generation 1's metagame due to few weaknesses and strong offensive presence, adding an even more powerful electric evolution would have further imbalanced the type distribution. The anime's launch and subsequent decision to keep Ash's Pikachu permanently unevolved accidentally vindicated the choice to cut Gorochu, as having a 3-stage evolution line would have created pressure to evolve Pikachu twice during the anime's run. The Eternal Pikachu became such an iconic image that the idea of it evolving even once, let alone twice, feels wrong to many fans who grew up watching the show. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Gorochu's name derives from the onomatopoeia Goro Goro, which represents the deep, rolling sound of thunder heard from a distance. This naming fits the pattern established by Pikachu and Raichu while suggesting even greater power and presence, as distant thunder implies a massive electrical storm approaching, rather than the small sparks of Pikachu or the closer strikes of Raichu. The decision to make Gorochu darker furred than Raichu would have continued the pattern of Pokémon gaining darker coloration as they evolve, something seen in various evolution lines throughout the series. This darkening often symbolizes maturity, increased power, or a more serious demeanor compared to earlier evolutionary stages. Gorochu's horns or fangs, prominent in the few design sketches that exist, suggest a more aggressive, possibly territorial personality compared to Pikachu's friendly nature. This personality shift through evolution appears in Pokédex entries for various Pokémon families, where final evolutions are described as losing their playful nature and becoming more focused or aggressive. The choice to remove Gorochu rather than cutting indifferent Pokémon reveals interesting priorities about what Game Freak considered essential to Generation 1's roster. Electric types were already well represented with multiple strong options, while types like Fighting, Ghost, and Dragon had very limited representation. Preserving type diversity apparently took priority over completing the Pikachu line. Fan reactions to Gorochu's confirmed existence have ranged from disappointment at its removal to understanding of the practical constraints that led to the decision. ROM hackers have created versions of Pokémon Red and Green that restore Gorochu using the surviving design sketches as references, allowing players to experience what might have been. The Blastoise situation reveals fascinating details about how Pokémon evolutionary lines were assembled during development, with some final evolutions being designed independently before being attached to appropriate first and second stages. Blastoise originated as the final stage of a different turtle line entirely, one that might have been more militaristic or technology-themed from the beginning. This original turtle line that Blastoise belonged to remains largely mysterious, with no surviving sprites or detailed design information about its earlier stages. Speculation suggests these earlier forms might have featured smaller cannons or water-shooting mechanisms that progressively developed into Blastoise's iconic shoulder-mounted artillery. The dramatic visual departure between Wartortle and Blastoise, particularly the loss of Wartortle's fluffy ears and tail in favor of Blastoise's armored appearance, results directly from this development history, where Blastoise was grafted onto the Squirtle line, rather than being designed as Wartortle's natural evolution. This explains why Blastoise's mega evolution and later generations partially restores some of Wartortle's lost features, as if trying to bridge the visual gap. Game Freak's willingness to splice evolutionary lines during development demonstrates pragmatic game design, where preserving 3 complete starter evolution lines took priority over maintaining perfect visual consistency within each line. The end result was ensuring all players had access to a fully evolved starter rather than leaving some lines incomplete. The alternate Wartortle evolution that was replaced by Blastoise apparently featured a more naturalistic design without mechanical elements, possibly emphasizing Wartortle's tail and ears growing larger and more elaborate as defining characteristics. This would have maintained better visual continuity with earlier stages, but potentially made the final form feel less impressive or powerful. Design philosophy during Generation 1's development seems to have valued making final evolutions feel dramatically different from their base forms, creating clear power progression that players could see visually. Blastoise's cannons instantly communicate power in a way that a simply larger turtle might not have, justifying the visual discontinuity for the sake of impact. The Marowak final evolution, featuring a baby Cubone, represents one of the most emotionally complex cut designs from Generation 1, as it would have explicitly confirmed the dark cycle implied by Cubone's backstory. This evolution standing upright and carrying its offspring would have created a complete family portrait that made the species' life cycle tragically clear. Kangaskhan's suspicious similarity to this cut Marowak evolution has spawned numerous fan theories about shared ancestry or split evolutionary lines, with some suggesting that Cubone represents baby Kangaskhan that lost their mothers, while normal baby Kangaskhan grow up to become Kangaskhan. The cut Marowak evolution, featuring a baby in a pouch, strongly suggests these connections were deliberate design choices rather than coincidence. The decision to remove this evolution might have come from concerns about making Cubone's already tragic backstory even darker by confirming that all Marowak inevitably produce offspring that will lose their mothers. This cycle of guaranteed orphaning would raise uncomfortable questions about Cubone biology and whether the species can even exist without maternal death. Another interpretation suggests the cut evolution was removed because it made the Kangaskhan connection too obvious, potentially confusing players about whether Cubone and Kangaskhan were related species. Leaving this relationship ambiguous through cutting the evolution allowed both design similarities and story implications to remain open to interpretation. The baby featured in the cut Marowak evolution's design appears to be wearing a skull like Cubone, suggesting this Pokémon represented a Marowak that had matured enough to reproduce while maintaining its connection to its own childhood trauma. This visual of a Marowak protecting its child while both wear skulls would have been emotionally powerful, but potentially too heavy for the game's tone. Alternative theories suggest the cut evolution might have been removed simply because giving Marowak a further evolution would have made the species too strong, as Marowak already has good attack stats and the Thick Club item doubling its attack power. Adding another evolutionary stage with even higher stats could have created balance issues. The Kangaskhan parallel might have been intentional during early development, but abandoned when designers realized it created narrative problems, leading to the cut evolution's removal and leaving Kangaskhan as a standalone Pokémon without explicit connection to the Cubone line. This severance allowed both Pokémon families to exist independently without the uncomfortable implications of their shared design elements. Cut moves from Generation 1's development offer insight into how battle mechanics evolved during the game's creation, with some attacks being removed due to balance concerns, while others were cut because they duplicated existing moves or introduced mechanics too complex for the Game Boy's hardware to handle smoothly. Certain status moves that appeared in early move lists never made it to the final game, including variations on confusion, paralysis, and sleep-inducing attacks that would have given more Pokémon access to these powerful battle control effects. The decision to limit status moves to specific Pokémon through TM distribution and natural move learning helped maintain balance by ensuring not every Pokémon could inflict every status condition. Elemental variations of physical attacks existed in early builds, but were consolidated to reduce redundancy, with moves like Fire Punch, Ice Punch, and Thunder Punch becoming the primary elemental physical attacks, while other variations like Fire, Kick, or Ice Slash were removed. This consolidation made the elemental punches more valuable and gave them clear identity as the go-to physical options for their respective types. Several multi-hit moves had their mechanics adjusted during development, with some moves hitting random numbers of times being changed to fixed numbers of hits for more consistent battle outcomes. This adjustment made multi-hit moves less frustrating while still maintaining their unique identity as attacks that could break through substitute or focus sash mechanics. Signature moves for legendary Pokémon underwent development changes, with some legendaries originally planned to have unique moves that were cut or reassigned to maintain balance. The decision to give each legendary bird its own signature move came relatively late in development, with Aeroblast and Sacred Fire appearing only in Generation 2, despite being conceptualized during Generation 1's development. Priority moves, which allow slower Pokémon to attack first, were carefully balanced during development, with several cut priority moves suggesting Game Freak experimented extensively with this mechanic before settling on Quick Attack as the primary normal-type priority option. Giving too many Pokémon access to priority moves would have devalued speed as a stat, so limiting priority move distribution became an important balance consideration. Cut HM moves beyond those discussed earlier included variations on Surf and Fly that would have functioned differently in or out of battle, with some proposals suggesting Surf should create whirlpools when used in battle, or Fly should have mid-air mechanics allowing multiple turn aerial combat. These mechanics proved too complex to implement on Game Boy hardware and were either simplified or cut entirely. Recoil moves underwent significant development iteration, with the ratio of damage dealt to recoil damage taken being adjusted multiple times during playtesting. Some cut recoil moves had extremely high damage output, but equally devastating recoil, making them impractical for regular use and leading to their removal in favor of more balanced alternatives. Weather-based moves existed in concept during Generation 1's development, but weren't fully implemented until Generation 2, with the early builds containing code for moves that would create weather effects like rain, sun, or sandstorms. The decision to delay weather mechanics until later generations came from concerns about adding too much complexity to the battle system before players understood basic type matchups and status conditions. Transformation moves beyond transform itself were conceptualized, with ideas for partial transformations that would copy only stats or only moves, rather than completely duplicating the target Pokémon. These moves were cut for being confusing to explain and implement, leaving transform as the only move in its mechanical category for several generations. Cut, multi-target moves that would hit all Pokémon on the field in double battles existed in concept, even though double battles themselves weren't implemented until Generation 3. This forward planning suggests Game Freak envisioned multi-Pokémon battles long before the hardware existed to support them, with some moves being designed with future generations in mind. The Ghost type in Generation 1 had infamous issues with move effectiveness due to programming errors that made Psychic types immune to Ghost moves, despite Ghost being intended as a counter. Cut Ghost moves from development might have been removed when this error was discovered, and developers realized that adding more Ghost attacks would exacerbate the balance problem. Cut Dark type moves existed in Generation 1's development long before Dark type itself was officially introduced in Generation 2, suggesting that the Dark type was conceptualized early but removed from Generation 1 when developers decided 17 types was too many for the initial game. These Cut Dark moves were later revived and properly implemented when Dark type became official. Charge-up moves that required a turn of preparation before dealing damage were carefully balanced during development, with Cut moves suggesting Game Freak experimented with various charge-up mechanics before settling on Solar Beam and Skull Bash as the primary representatives of this category. Too many charge moves would have slowed battle pace excessively, so limiting them maintained dynamic combat flow. Interesting Cut mechanics from Generation 1's development reveal experimental features that were ultimately deemed too complex or unbalanced for the final release. These mechanics ranged from battle system alternatives to exploration features that would have significantly changed how players interacted with Kanto's world. The stamina system that appeared in extremely early builds would have given Pokémon a separate resource for using moves in addition to PP, similar to magic points in traditional RPGs. This system was quickly abandoned during early playtesting when it became clear that managing two different resource types for moves made battles too complicated and slowed gameplay to a frustrating degree. Under the stamina system, powerful moves would have cost more stamina to use even if they had PP remaining, forcing players to carefully manage when to use their strongest attacks rather than spamming them whenever PP was available. The removal of this system made battles more accessible, but also less strategic in some ways, as PP management alone provides simpler decision-making. Physical and special split mechanics were conceptualized during Generation 1, but not implemented until Generation 4 due to programming limitations and concerns about complexity. Early design documents show moves being classified as physical or special regardless of type, but the Game Boy's memory constraints made storing this additional data for every move impractical given the already tight cartridge space. Time of day mechanics were planned for Generation 1, but couldn't be implemented due to the original Game Boy lacking an internal clock. These mechanics would have made certain Pokémon appear only during specific times, changed NPC dialogue based on day or night, and potentially affected move power or accuracy depending on when battles occurred. The concept was shelved until Generation 2, when Game Boy Color's hardware allowed for real-time clock functionality. Weather effects during exploration rather than just in battle were conceptualized, with early designs showing rain or snow appearing on overworld maps and affecting wild Pokémon encounters or move effectiveness. This feature was cut for being too memory-intensive, as storing weather data for every route and updating sprites to reflect weather conditions would have required space the cartridge couldn't spare. Seasons were another cut mechanic that would have rotated every few weeks or months, changing which Pokémon appeared in certain areas and altering the appearance of some routes. This concept wouldn't be properly implemented until Generation 5 with black and white, showing how far ahead some of Game Freak's early concepts were relative to available technology. Hunger mechanics for Pokémon in the party were briefly considered, with Pokémon needing to be fed regularly or suffering stat penalties during battle. This survival game element was quickly abandoned for being too punishing and distracting from the core catching and battling gameplay, though the concept partially resurfaced in Pokémon Amy and similar friendship mechanics in later generations. Terrain effects beyond just water and land were planned, with different terrain types like mud, snow, or rocky ground affecting movement speed and encounter rates. The decision to limit terrain variety kept map design simpler and prevented players from becoming frustrated by movement penalties, though terrain effects eventually appeared in modified form in later generations. Dynamic route changes based on player actions were conceptualized, with some routes potentially becoming blocked or opened depending on story progression or NPC interactions. This feature was partially implemented through cut trees and boulder-blocked caves, but wasn't as extensive as originally planned, with most routes remaining static throughout the entire game. Rental Pokémon systems, beyond the Safari Zone's unique catching mechanic, were considered, with ideas for renting powerful Pokémon temporarily for specific challenges or areas. This was cut for diminishing the importance of raising your own team and potentially allowing players to brute force difficult battles with borrowed power. The camping mechanic that would appear in later generations had very early concept sketches during Generation 1's development, with ideas for players setting up camp on routes to heal Pokémon without visiting Pokémon centers. This was cut because it would have reduced the importance of Pokémon centers as landmarks and recovery points, while also requiring significant memory for camping menus and animations. Multiple save files were planned before being reduced to a single save file per cartridge, with the limitation coming from memory constraints that made storing multiple complete save states impractical. This single save file limitation became a defining characteristic of main series Pokémon games for decades, only changing in recent generations with expanded hardware capabilities. The difficulty settings that appear in later games were conceptualized during Generation 1, but cut for being too complex to balance properly. Different difficulty modes would have required adjusting levels, AI behavior, and item availability for every trainer and wild encounter, multiplying the development workload beyond what the small team could handle. These cut mechanics reveal how ambitious Game Freak's vision for Pokémon was from the beginning, with many features that couldn't be implemented in 1996 eventually appearing in later generations as hardware improved and development teams grew larger. The restraint shown in cutting features that couldn't be properly implemented rather than forcing them into the game likely contributed to Generation 1's tight, focused design. Cut items from Generation 1 offer another window into discarded game systems and features, with various key items, held items, and consumables being removed during development, either because they were redundant or because they enabled exploits that broke game balance. The surfboard item, related to but distinct from the Lapras item discussed earlier, would have been a reusable tool for water travel that didn't require any specific Pokémon or HM. This item was cut in favor of making Surf and HM move, ensuring that players needed to catch water-type Pokémon and maintain them in their party rather than trivializing water navigation with a simple key item. Various evolution stones beyond the fire, water, thunder, leaf, and moonstones that made it to the final game were conceptualized, including Lightstone and Darkstone, that would eventually appear in later generations. These additional stones were cut from Generation 1 to avoid overwhelming players with too many evolution methods while also limiting the number of stone evolution Pokémon in Kanto's Pokédex. Held items as a mechanic were conceptualized during Generation 1's development, but not implemented until Generation 2 due to memory limitations and interface complexity. Early design documents reference items that Pokémon could hold for stat boosts or special effects, but implementing this system would have required expanding the Pokémon data structure beyond what the Game Boy's limited RAM could efficiently handle. Cut battle items included various temporary stat boosters that were more powerful than the X items that made it into the final game, with some removed for being too strong and essentially guaranteeing victory if used properly. The decision to make stat-boosting items less powerful in the final version maintained battle difficulty, while still giving players tools to overcome tough fights. Evolution-canceling items beyond the Everstone existed in early builds, with some items that would force evolution even if the B button was pressed, or others that would permanently prevent a Pokémon from ever evolving. These were cut for being confusing and potentially causing players to accidentally lock themselves out of evolutions they wanted. Rare candy alternatives that raised specific stats instead of granting a full level existed in some development builds, allowing players to customize their Pokémon's growth more precisely. This system was cut for being too complicated and potentially allowing players to create unbalanced Pokémon by manipulating stat growth beyond what normal training would allow. The Master Ball alternatives were conceptualized, including variations that would have 100% catch rate only on specific types or only in certain areas. These specialized Master Balls were cut in favor of keeping just one ultimate catching tool that worked everywhere, maintaining the Master Ball's status as a precious, singular item that players needed to use carefully. Various key items for bypassing HM requirements existed in early builds, with items that would permanently grant surf, fly, or cut capabilities without needing to teach moves to Pokémon. These were cut because they would have eliminated the party-building strategy involved in deciding which Pokémon to teach HM moves and how to balance utility with battle effectiveness. Cut medicine items that cured multiple status conditions simultaneously or provided full healing without visiting a Pokémon Center would have made resource management trivial and reduced the importance of Pokémon Centers as landmarks. Keeping healing items limited in scope maintained tension during dungeon exploration and ensured players needed to carefully manage their resources. Permanent stat boost items that could be used unlimited times were adjusted to the vitamin system that caps how many can be used per stat, with the change coming after playtesters demonstrated how permanent unlimited stat boosts could break game balance. The cap system maintained vitamins' utility while preventing players from creating unstoppable Pokémon through item abuse. Fossil-related items beyond the Helix and Dome fossils were conceptualized, with some early builds featuring additional fossils for Pokémon that were cut during development. These extra fossils were removed when their corresponding Pokémon were cut, leaving just Omanite, Kabuto, and Aerodactyl as Generation 1's fossil Pokémon. Cut areas from Kanto's map reveal planned locations that were removed during development to save memory or because they didn't fit the final game's pacing and structure. These cut areas range from entire cities to smaller dungeons and routes that would have expanded exploration options significantly. An entire Safari Zone area focused on desert and rock-type Pokémon was designed but removed before implementation, with this desert zone potentially appearing in the space between Lavender Town and Fuchsia City. The cut area would have featured ground and rock-type Pokémon that were otherwise rare in Kanto, providing an alternative catching location for species that only appeared in late-game areas. The lighthouse near Vermilion City was originally planned to be enterable and explorable, with multiple floors containing trainers and possibly a mini-dungeon element. This lighthouse interior was cut to save development time and cartridge space, leaving the lighthouse as an exterior landmark that players can see but never access. An underground network of caves connecting various cities was conceptualized as an alternative to flying between locations, with these caves featuring their own unique wild Pokémon and trainers. This underground network was simplified into the few underground paths that did make it to the final game, with the more elaborate cave system being cut for being too complex and potentially confusing for navigation. Additional floors for Sylph Combing were planned before being reduced to the 11 floors present in the final game, with cut floors potentially featuring more Team Rocket encounters and puzzles. The decision to limit Sylphcomb's size came from concerns about players getting lost or frustrated in the building's already complex warp tile puzzle layout. A second power plant location was conceptualized for northwestern Kanto, possibly near Viridian City, that would have been home to electric-type Pokémon different from those appearing in the existing power plant. This second facility was cut when designers realized that having two identical locations would feel repetitive and wouldn't add meaningful content to justify the memory usage. Cerulean Cave originally had plans for significantly more floors and complexity than what made it to the final game, with some early maps showing up to 5 basement levels extending deep underground. These additional floors were simplified when balancing teams realized that navigating that many floors to reach Mewtwo would be tedious rather than challenging. A volcano dungeon separate from Cinnabar Island's volcano was planned for southwestern Kanto, potentially accessible by surfing south from Pallet Town to a new island. This volcano dungeon would have featured fire-type Pokémon and possibly a legendary Firebird, but it was cut when developers decided that 3 legendary birds were sufficient and that adding another fire-focused area would be redundant with Cinnabar Island. The Pokémon League building was originally planned to have explorable floors with trainers, shops, and rest areas before the Elite Four challenges, but these areas were cut to make the Pokémon League feel more focused and climactic. The final version's streamlined design, with just a Pokémon Center and direct access to the Elite Four chamber, creates better pacing for the game's conclusion. Additional routes connecting existing cities were mapped during early development before being cut to keep Kanto's geography manageable and navigable. These cut routes would have provided alternative paths between locations, creating a more interconnected world, but they were removed when designers realized that too many route options would make navigation confusing rather than freeing. A second sea route running along Kanto's western coast was conceptualized, potentially connecting Cinnabar Island to Viridian City by water, but this route was cut to avoid making water navigation too central to the game's progression. The existing water routes already provide substantial surfing content, and adding more would have risked making the late game feel like too much required swimming. An expanded Victory Road with branching paths and multiple entrances from different routes was designed but simplified to the single-path version in the final game. The more complex Victory Road would have allowed players to approach it from multiple angles and potentially skip sections, but this freedom was removed to ensure Victory Road felt like a definitive final challenge before the Elite Four. Cut trainer classes revealed planned opponent types that were removed during development, with some classes being consolidated into others, while some were cut entirely for being redundant or not fitting Kanto's theme properly. The Scientist Trainer class was significantly expanded in early builds, with variants including mad scientists, lab assistants, and research professors who would have appeared in more locations than just Silphcombe and Cinnabar Mansion. These variants were consolidated into the single scientist class to reduce sprite variety needs and simplify the trainer roster. Knight and Samurai trainer classes existed in very early designs when developers were still unsure whether Pokémon would be set in a pure fantasy world or a modern setting, with these classes being removed once the decision was made to set Kanto in a contemporary world with modern technology. Traces of these classes survived in some trainer poses and dialogue that reference medieval combat styles. A psychic trainer class variant, specifically for hypnotists, was designed but merged into the standard psychic class, with hypnotists originally planned to use Pokémon with sleep-inducing moves exclusively. This specialization was deemed too narrow, and the standard psychic class was broadened to use various psychic types rather than being locked into specific movesets. The Team Rocket Grunt class had numerous variants planned based on rank and specialization, with Rocket admins, Rocket scientists, and Rocket elites all appearing in early trainer rosters. These variants were simplified to just grunts, with the notable exception of Giovanni, with other Team Rocket leadership being cut or simplified to avoid making the organization's hierarchy too complex for players to understand. Ace trainer variants, including veteran trainers and tactical trainers, were conceptualized as late-game trainer classes that would use fully evolved Pokémon with optimized movesets, but these were merged into the Cool Trainer class to avoid confusion. The Cool Trainer class's name and appearance don't strongly communicate endgame challenge, but they fulfill that role despite the somewhat casual branding. Artist and photographer trainer classes were designed for Kanto's more urban areas, with these trainers using Pokémon inspired by artistic themes like Smeargle or Pokémon with interesting colors and patterns. These classes were cut when Smeargle itself was cut from Generation 1, with the artist concept being delayed until later generations. Factory Worker Trainer class was planned to appear in Vermilion City and other industrial areas, with these trainers using Steel-type Pokémon before Steel-type was officially introduced in Generation 2. The class was cut along with most Steel-type Pokémon, leaving just Magnemite's Evolutionary line as representation of metallic Pokémon in Generation 1. Cut dialogue from Kanto's NPCs offers insight into storylines and characterizations that were removed or simplified during development, with some dialogue trees being far more complex than what made it to the final game, while others reveal entirely different story directions. Professor Oak originally had significantly more dialogue explaining Kanto's history, the Pokémon ecosystem, and the player character's role in his research, with this exposition being cut for pacing reasons. Early players would have received more context about why they were starting their journey, but the final version's minimal explanation forces players to discover the world's lore through exploration. Giovanni's dialogue underwent several revisions that changed his characterization from a misunderstood villain with sympathetic motives to the more straightforward antagonist that appears in the final game. Cut dialogue revealed his backstory and reasons for leading Team Rocket, with these details being removed to keep the story focused and avoid creating moral ambiguity that might confuse younger players. The rival character's dialogue was significantly harsher in early builds, with more aggressive taunting and meaner insults that playtesters found off-putting. The final version's dialogue maintains the rival's competitive attitude, but softens his worst qualities, making him feel more like a spirited competitor rather than a genuine bully. Gym leader dialogue extended beyond simple pre-battle and post-battle conversations in early builds, with plans for leaders to offer advice, discuss their training philosophies, and provide hints about upcoming challenges. This additional dialogue was cut to keep gym battles focused and maintain consistent pacing across all 8 gyms. Elite Four members had backstories that were removed from their dialogue, with each member originally having connections to specific areas of Kanto or histories with certain Pokémon species. Lorelei's connection to the Seafoam Islands was meant to be more explicit, with dialogue revealing she trained there as a young girl. Bruno's backstory involved training on Victory Road for years before joining the Elite Four, with cut dialogue describing his dedication to perfecting fighting-type techniques. Agatha's removed dialogue revealed a past friendship with Professor Oak that turned bitter, explaining her harsh attitude and preference for ghost types that reflected her dark outlook on life. Lance's backstory was meant to be more mysterious, with cut dialogue hinting at his connection to Blackthorn City and the Dragon's Den that wouldn't be fully revealed until Gold and Silver. NPCs throughout Kanto had their dialogue reduced from multi-line conversations to single sentences, with memory limitations forcing developers to compress characterization into minimal text. Some cut dialogue revealed complex personalities and motivations for seemingly insignificant characters, but these details were sacrificed to keep file sizes manageable. The old man who teaches players how to catch Pokémon originally had extended dialogue explaining the history of Pokémon catching techniques and the development of the Pokéball, but this exposition was cut to a brief demonstration that serves gameplay purposes without overwhelming new players with lore. Team Rocket grunts had varied dialogue in early builds based on their location and role within the organization, with grunts in Silphcompin having different personalities than those in the Game Corner hideout. This variation was simplified to standardized grunt dialogue that could be reused across encounters, saving memory while maintaining the sense that Team Rocket was an organized crime syndicate. Bill's dialogue about his Pokémon storage system was significantly longer in early builds, explaining the technology behind PC boxes and how Pokémon are converted to data for storage. This technical explanation was cut for being too complicated and potentially raising uncomfortable questions about Pokémon consciousness and the ethics of data storage. The Name Raiders dialogue was meant to be more comedic and personality-driven, with different responses based on what nickname a Pokémon had and whether it was appropriate or offensive. This dynamic dialogue system was cut for being too complex to implement, leaving just the basic renaming functionality. Mr. Fuji's dialogue in Lavender Town was trimmed from a longer conversation about Pokémon spirits and the afterlife, with cut lines discussing what happens to Pokémon when they die and whether they move on to another realm. These philosophical discussions were removed to keep the game's tone lighter and avoid introducing concepts that might be difficult for young players to process. The Silphcompin president's dialogue after being rescued was significantly expanded in early versions, with plans for him to explain the company's research into Pokémon technology and hint at future innovations. This was simplified to brief thanks and the Master Ball gift to keep the post-rescue sequence short and focused on rewarding the player rather than delivering exposition. Cinnabar Island's researchers had individual dialogue trees in early builds that would change based on which Pokémon the player had in their party, with scientists offering specific comments about rare or unusual species. This dynamic dialogue was cut for being too memory intensive, as it would require storing conditionals for all 151 Pokémon. Safari Zone Warden's dialogue about his lost teeth was meant to be part of a longer side quest involving multiple NPCs and locations, but this was simplified to a single fetch quest to keep the Safari Zone's narrative focused. Cut dialogue revealed the teeth were a family heirloom with sentimental value beyond just being dentures. Fishermen along Kanto's coasts had dialogue that changed based on what Pokémon the player had caught through fishing, with fishermen offering tips about rare species or congratulating players on impressive catches. This tracking system was cut for requiring too much memory to store player fishing data. The Move to Leader character was conceptualized for Generation 1, but didn't appear until later games, with early dialogue written for an NPC in Fuchsia City who would help players remove unwanted HM moves. This character and their dialogue were cut when developers decided that HM moves being difficult to remove was an intentional design choice that encouraged careful team planning. Cut music tracks from Generation 1 reveal unused compositions that were created but never assigned to locations or situations in the final game. These tracks offer insight into areas, events, or moods that were planned but removed during development. An unused victory fanfare, distinct from the standard battle victory theme, suggests alternate victory conditions or special battles that were cut from the game. This fanfare was more elaborate than the standard theme, possibly intended for winning particularly difficult or story-important battles that would warrant unique celebration. A somber theme, labeled in development files as Lost Theme, was composed but never used, suggesting that losing battles might have had more significant consequences or story implications in early designs. The decision to make losing simply return players to the last Pokémon Center might have made this theme unnecessary. An unused version of the Pokémon Center theme with slightly different instrumentation exists in the game's data, possibly intended for special Pokémon centers or centers in specific locations. The standardization of the Pokémon Center theme across all locations made this variation redundant. A shorter, more intense version of the Team Rocket battle theme appears in unused music data, possibly intended for encounters with Team Rocket admins or commanders who were cut from the game. This theme's existence suggests that Team Rocket's organizational structure was meant to be more complex than what appears in the final version. An unused route theme with a more mysterious, exploratory feel might have been intended for cave systems or dungeons that were cut, as its mood doesn't match any location in the final game. The theme's minor key and slower tempo suggest it was composed for areas meant to feel foreboding or uncertain. A triumphant theme, labeled Achievement Theme in development files, was never assigned to any in-game event, possibly intended for completing the Pokédex or achieving other optional goals. The decision not to include elaborate achievement fanfares kept the game's reward structure simple and focused on progression rather than completion. An alternate version of the Elite Four battle theme exists with different instrumentation, suggesting that different Elite Four members might have had unique themes before the decision was made to give them all the same battle music. Differentiating Elite Four members through unique themes would have required more cartridge space and made their battles feel less connected as a sequential challenge. A calm, reflective theme that doesn't appear anywhere in the final game was possibly intended for ending sequences or post-game exploration, with its peaceful mood suggesting it was meant to play after major accomplishments or during quiet moments of reflection. An unused evolution theme variation with slightly different timing might have been intended for special evolutions or trade evolutions, differentiating these important transformations from standard level-up evolutions. The decision to use one evolution theme for all evolutions simplified the audio experience while maintaining consistency. A battle intro theme that goes unused in the final game was possibly intended to play before important battles began, creating anticipation similar to how later games implement battle intro stings for significant encounters. This theme's removal kept battle flow immediate, without additional audio transitions. The rival encounter theme underwent several iterations, with unused versions showing different approaches to characterizing the rival through music. Some versions were more aggressive and confrontational, while others felt more friendly and competitive, with the final version striking a balance between these extremes. Cut sound effects complement the unused music tracks, with various Pokémon cries, environmental sounds, and interface noises being created but never implemented in the final game. Several Pokémon have unused cry variations in the game's data, suggesting that cries might have changed based on the Pokémon's level, health status, or other factors. This dynamic cry system was cut for being too subtle to notice and requiring memory to store multiple cry variations for each Pokémon. Environmental sound effects like wind, rain, and waves appear in development data, but were never implemented in the overworld, as the Game Boy's audio limitations made playing background sounds alongside music impractical. Later games would implement environmental audio more successfully with better hardware. Interface sounds for systems that were cut remain in the game's audio files, including sounds for the stamina system, hunger mechanics, and other removed features. These orphaned sound effects exist as echoes of game systems that never made it to players. Alternate Pokeball sound effects suggest different types of Pokeballs beyond the standard, Great, Ultra, and Master Balls were conceptualized, with unique sounds for catching Pokemon with different ball types. The decision to limit ball variety in Generation 1 made these alternate sounds unnecessary. A sound effect for Pokemon fainting in the overworld rather than just in battle exists, but goes unused, suggesting that Pokemon might have been able to faint from environmental hazards or time passing without healing. This mechanic was cut to keep overworld exploration stress-free. Unused footstep sounds for running or faster movement suggest that a run button or running shoes mechanic was conceptualized for Generation 1 before being delayed until Generation 2. The lack of running in Generation 1's final version made these sound effects obsolete. Menu navigation sounds underwent multiple iterations, with unused variations showing different approaches to audio feedback for player inputs. The final menu sounds were chosen for being clear and satisfying without becoming annoying through repetition. Cry variations for shiny Pokémon existed in development, despite shiny Pokémon themselves not being fully implemented until Generation 2. These alternate cries would have made shiny Pokémon immediately identifiable through sound, but the feature was delayed when shiny mechanics weren't ready for Generation 1's release. Cut animations and sprite variations reveal visual elements that were designed but not implemented in the final game, with some animations being too complex for the Game Boy's hardware, while others were simply deemed unnecessary. Walking animations for Pokémon following the player in the overworld exist in fragmentary form in development data, predating Pokémon Yellow's implementation of Pikachu following the player by years. This feature was cut from the original Red and Green for being too memory intensive, with each Pokémon requiring multiple walking sprites and animation frames. Battle animations for moves were significantly more elaborate in early builds, with some attacks having longer, more detailed animations that were simplified or cut when developers realized they would slow battle pace too much. The final game's quick, efficient animations prioritized keeping battles moving over visual spectacle. Pokémon status condition sprites showing visible effects of poison, paralysis, burn, and other conditions were designed but not implemented, as overlaying these effects on Pokémon sprites proved technically challenging with the Game Boy's limited graphics capabilities. Later games with more powerful hardware, could implement visible status effects more successfully. Overworld sprite variations for weather effects like rain or snow existed in concept, with player and NPC sprites potentially changing appearance based on weather conditions. This feature was cut when weather effects themselves were removed from Generation 1's Overworld cut evolution animations for specific Pokémon that evolved through unusual means existed in early builds, with trait evolutions potentially having different animation sequences than level-up evolutions. The standardization of evolution animations across all methods simplified an implementation while maintaining consistency. The Pokédex interface had more elaborate designs in early mock-ups, with animations showing Pokémon rotating, displaying different poses, or reacting to player input. These animated Pokédex features were cut to keep the interface functional and fast-loading on Game Boy hardware. Cut gameplay mechanics, beyond those already discussed, reveal experimental systems that were tested during development, but ultimately removed for being too complex, unbalanced, or incompatible with Pokémon's core design philosophy. A morality system where player choices affected story outcomes and NPC reactions was briefly conceptualized before being rejected as incompatible with Pokémon's lighthearted, adventure-focused tone. This system would have tracked good and evil actions, potentially leading to different endings or rival encounters based on player behavior. Under this cut morality system, stealing items, knocking out wild Pokémon without catching them, or refusing to help NPCs would have been considered negative actions, while helping people, catching and training diverse teams, and showing compassion toward Pokémon would earn positive morality points. The system was removed when developers realized it would make players feel judged rather than free to play how they wanted. Experience sharing mechanics different from the XP. Share item were tested, with some builds allowing party Pokémon to gain experience even when not participating in battle without needing a held item. This automatic experience sharing was removed to maintain the importance of actively using Pokémon in battle and to prevent teams from becoming overleveled. Pokémon personality systems, beyond just nature stats, existed in very early concepts, with the individual Pokémon potentially having likes, dislikes, and behavioral quirks that affected their battle performance or evolution. This depth of personality simulation was deemed too complex for the Game Boy's memory and processing capabilities. Under the cut personality system, Pokémon might have refused to use certain moves, performed better or worse based on opponent type preferences, or required specific training methods to reach their full potential. This level of individual personality would have made each Pokémon feel unique, but also potentially frustrating when personality traits conflicted with player strategy. Dynamic difficulty adjustment that scaled trainer and wild Pokémon levels based on player team strength was tested but removed for creating inconsistent challenge and potentially confusing players about progression. The static level curves in the final game provide predictable difficulty that players can prepare for and strategize around. Permadeath options, where Pokémon that fainted couldn't be revived, were conceptualized as hardcore difficulty settings, but rejected for being too punishing and potentially causing players to lose Pokémon they'd bonded with through hours of training. This concept wouldn't be officially recognized until fan-created Nuzlocke challenges popularized self-imposed permadeath rules years later. Breeding mechanics existed in concept during Generation 1's development, but weren't implemented until Generation 2 due to complexity concerns. Early breeding concepts were more complicated than what eventually appeared in Gold and Silver, with ideas about inherited moves, stats, and even personality traits, making the system too elaborate for initial implementation. Skill trees, or customizable move, learning paths, where players could choose which moves their Pokémon learned through leveling, were briefly considered before being rejected for adding unnecessary complexity to an already deep game. The final designs fixed level-up movesets, simplified team building, while still allowing customization through TMs and HMs. Minigames beyond the slot machines in Celadon Game Corner were planned, including card games, Pokémon races, and skill-based challenges that would reward players with rare items or Pokémon. These minigames were cut to keep Kanto's content focused on exploration and battling rather than distracting players with side activities. Under the cut minigame system, players might have been able to enter their Pokémon in races similar to those seen in the anime, with race performance determined by speed stats, player timing inputs, and random chance. The prizes for winning races would have included rare Pokémon or items not available through normal gameplay. Card battle minigames that predated the actual Pokémon trading card game were conceptualized with ideas for NPCs challenging players to simplified card battles using representations of their Pokémon teams. This was cut when developers decided that having two different battle systems would confuse players and dilute focus from the main battle mechanics. Seasonal events that would change NPC dialogue, available Pokémon, or item shop inventory were planned before being cut due to the original Game Boy lacking internal clock functionality. These events would have given players reasons to revisit areas during different times of year, but an implementation wasn't feasible without real-time tracking. Photo mode features where players could take snapshots of their Pokémon in various locations were conceptualized years before Pokémon Snap existed, with early ideas about documenting Pokémon in their natural habitats. This feature was cut for being too memory-intensive and tangential to core gameplay, though it eventually inspired the Pokémon Snap spin-off game. Reputation systems, where player actions in one town affected how NPCs in other towns that treated them, were designed but removed for adding unnecessary complication to Kanto's straightforward progression. The final game's approach, where each location treats the player consistently, regardless of actions elsewhere, simplified interactions and prevented players from accidentally making areas hostile through misunderstood mechanics. Hunger and fatigue systems that would have required players to regularly feed their Pokémon and provide rest were tested in very early prototypes before being rejected as too demanding and punishing. These survival mechanics would have added resource management depth, but also constant maintenance requirements that detracted from exploration and battling fun. Under the cut hunger system, Pokémon would have gradually become hungry during exploration, requiring players to carry and use Pokémon food items regularly or suffer stat penalties during battles. This constant need to feed teams was deemed too annoying and potentially upsetting for players who forgot to manage hunger and found their Pokémon weakened. The fatigue system would have tracked how many battles each Pokémon fought, requiring rest periods where they couldn't be used or they would suffer exhaustion penalties. This would have forced players to rotate through multiple team members rather than relying on a few favorites, but it was cut for potentially frustrating players who wanted to focus on raising specific Pokémon. Territory control mechanics, where rival trainers or Team Rocket could claim areas of Kanto and prevent player access until defeated, were conceptualized as dynamic world elements. These mechanics were cut when developers realized they would create confusing situations where players couldn't progress because certain areas were randomly blocked. Weather-based type advantages beyond the weather moves themselves existed in early designs, with ideas about rain boosting water moves and weakening fire moves even outside of battle. This environmental strategy layer was deemed too complex for Generation 1 and was simplified into the weather effect system that appeared in later games. Pokémon-specific field abilities beyond HM moves were planned, with ideas about certain species having unique overworld interactions based on their type or characteristics. Examples included fire types being able to melt ice, psychic types sensing hidden items, and ghost types passing through certain obstacles. These species-specific abilities were cut to avoid making some Pokémon feel mandatory for exploration. Team composition requirements for accessing certain areas beyond just HM moves existed in concept, with gates that would only open if players had specific type combinations or Pokémon meeting certain criteria in their party. This gate system was simplified to just HM requirements and badge checks to avoid making progression too dependent on catching specific Pokémon. Dynamic trainer AI that adapted to player strategies during battle was tested but removed for being too difficult to implement effectively on Game Boy hardware. The static AI patterns in the final game provide consistent challenge without requiring complex behavior trees or learning algorithms. Post-game story content beyond just catching Mewtwo and completing the Pokédex was planned but cut due to time and resource constraints. Ideas for post-championship story events included Team Rocket returning, legendary Pokémon causing problems, and exploration of new areas that would only open after becoming champion. Cut lore and world-building elements reveal deeper stories about Kanto's history, Pokémon origins, and the relationship between humans and Pokémon that were designed but never fully communicated to players. Ancient civilization ruins scattered throughout Kanto were meant to tell a story about past humans who lived alongside legendary Pokémon and potentially worshipped them. Fragments of this lore remain in Cinnabar Mansion's journals, but cut dialogue would have connected these fragments into a cohesive history. The creation story of Pokémon and their relationship to the natural world was originally explained in detail through NPC dialogue and readable text found in libraries or research facilities. This cosmological lore was cut to keep the game's focus on the present adventure rather than ancient history, though it would be explored more deeply in later generations. Legendary Pokémon origin stories detailing why Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres exist and what their purpose is in Kanto's ecosystem were written but never fully implemented. Cut text described the birds as ancient guardians of elemental forces who maintain natural balance, with their presence in specific locations being intentional rather than random. Mewtwo's creation story was meant to be told through more extensive diary entries in Cinnabar Mansion, with additional journal pages describing the ethical debates within the research team and the consequences they faced when Mewtwo escaped. These extra entries were cut to leave Mewtwo's story somewhat ambiguous and mysterious. The history of Pokéball technology and how humans learned to catch and store Pokémon was originally explained through museum exhibits and researcher dialogue. This technical history revealing how Pokéballs convert Pokémon to energy for storage raised philosophical questions about Pokémon consciousness that developers decided to avoid by cutting the detailed explanations. Team Rocket's founding and Giovanni's backstory were meant to be revealed through dialogue and discoverable documents, with cut story elements explaining how the organization began as a legitimate business before turning to crime. This sympathetic framing of Team Rocket was removed to keep the villains clearly antagonistic without moral ambiguity. The relationship between Professor Oak and Agatha was meant to be explored more deeply, with cut dialogue revealing they were research partners in their youth before a falling out over the ethics of Pokémon research. Agatha's bitterness toward Oak and preference for ghost types were connected to this past betrayal. Blue's family situation and why he lives with Professor Oak rather than his parents was originally addressed through NPC dialogue, with hints about his parents being away on extended business or research trips. This backstory was cut to keep Blue's character focused on his rivalry with the player rather than his personal circumstances. The reason why 10-year-olds are allowed to travel unsupervised with potentially dangerous creatures was never explained in the final game, but cut dialogue suggested that Kanto society has specific coming-of-age traditions where young people prove themselves through Pokémon journeys. This cultural context was removed to avoid raising questions about child safety that would distract from the adventure. Pokémon migration patterns and seasonal variations in which species appear where were conceptualized as part of Kanto's ecology, with cut Pokédex entries describing how certain Pokémon travel between regions based on weather or breeding seasons. This ecological detail was simplified in the final game, where Pokémon distributions remain static. The Pokémon League's history and how it was established as the ultimate test for trainers was meant to be revealed through dialogue with Elite Four members and NPCs in the League building. Cut story elements described the League as a relatively recent institution created to formalize trainer progression and provide goals for aspiring champions. Extinct Pokémon beyond the fossil species were referenced in cut dialogue, with mentions of species that died out before modern times and whose remains occasionally surface in archaeological digs. This expansion of Pokémon paleontology was cut to keep focus on the fossil Pokémon players could actually obtain. The relationship between different regions and how Kanto connects to the broader Pokémon world was originally hinted at through NPC dialogue mentioning distant lands. These references were cut when developers decided to keep Generation 1 entirely focused on Kanto without teasing future regions. Cut graphical elements and visual effects reveal artistic directions that were tested during development before being simplified or removed for technical or aesthetic reasons. Detailed battle backgrounds for different terrain types were designed but simplified to the basic patterns in the final game, as rendering complex backgrounds would have required memory better spent on Pokémon sprites and animations. Early battle backgrounds showed detailed grass fields, rocky caves, or water surfaces that were reduced to simple patterns. Dynamic lighting effects for moves like flash or fire-type attacks were conceptualized but couldn't be implemented effectively on the Game Boy's screen technology, which lacked the contrast range needed to make lighting effects visible. Later games on Game Boy Color and beyond could implement lighting more successfully. Weather effects visible in overworld graphics existed in development mockups, with rain, snow, or fog potentially appearing on routes and in cities. These effects were cut when developers realized they would require creating separate sprite sets for all terrain tiles in multiple weather states, consuming excessive memory. Reflection effects for water surfaces that would show mirrored versions of sprites standing near water were designed but proved too technically demanding for the Game Boy's tile-based graphics system. Implementing true reflections would have required doubling sprite data or creating complex mirroring routines that would slow down the game. Pokémon size variations, where individual Pokémon of the same species could appear larger or smaller in battle, were conceptualized but cut for requiring separate sprite sets for size variants. This size variation system wouldn't appear until later generations implemented it through simpler numerical displays rather than visual representation. Seasonal palette swaps for overworld tiles that would change tree colors from green to orange in autumn or white in winter were designed but couldn't be implemented without real-time clock functionality. These seasonal visuals would have made Kanto feel more dynamic, but required hardware capabilities the original Game Boy lacked. Animated water tiles with flowing patterns or rippling effects were designed but simplified to the basic animated water in the final game due to performance concerns. More complex water animation would have required more CPU cycles for tile updates, potentially causing slowdown during gameplay. Building interior variations that would make each house or building feel unique rather than using repeated interior templates were designed but cut to save memory. The final game reuses interior layouts extensively, with cut designs showing more diverse room arrangements and furniture placements. Pokémon following behavior for species beyond Pikachu in yellow existed in concept art, with designs showing how different body types and movement styles would translate to overworld following sprites. This variety of following Pokémon was cut from even Pokémon Yellow due to memory constraints, leaving only Pikachu implemented. Menu interface variations for different contexts or locations were designed but simplified to the consistent menu system throughout the final game. Cut interfaces showed different color schemes or layout adjustments for menus accessed in Pokémon centers versus menus in the overworld. Battle system variations beyond the standard one-on-one format were tested during Generation 1's development, with some experiments predating the double battles, rotation battles, and other formats that would appear in later generations by many years. 2 versus 2 battles, where each trainer controlled 2 Pokémon, simultaneously existed in very early concept documents, with designers exploring how to display 4 Pokémon on screen at once and handle targeting mechanics. This format was cut when it became clear that the Game Boy's screen size couldn't comfortably display 4 Pokémon sprites, health bars, and battle menus simultaneously without everything becoming cramped and difficult to read. Tag team battles where 2 trainers on the same side could switch control between their Pokémon were conceptualized as a way to make multi-trainer battles feel more dynamic and strategic. This system was removed for being too confusing to explain and implement, with concerns that players wouldn't understand when they could control which Pokémon or how to coordinate strategies with AI partners. Reverse battles, where type effectiveness worked backwards, with super effective moves dealing reduced damage and not very effective moves dealing increased damage, were tested as potential post-game challenge modes. This inversion was cut for feeling more frustrating than fun, as it required players to unlearn everything they'd been taught about type matchups throughout the main game. Survival mode battles, where players fought continuous waves of increasingly difficult opponents without healing between matches, were designed for post-game challenge facilities. This endurance format was cut from Generation 1, but eventually appeared in later games through the Battle Tower and similar facilities, showing how cut ideas often resurface in refined form years later. Timed battles, where players had limited seconds to choose moves each turn, were tested to increase battle intensity and prevent players from spending excessive time deliberating over decisions. This time, pressure was removed when playtesters found it stressful rather than exciting, particularly younger players who needed more time to read move descriptions and consider options. The critical hit system underwent numerous balance adjustments during development, with the early builds using different formulas that made critical hits either too common or too rare. Some cut critical hit mechanics included guaranteed crits based on move type matching Pokémon type, critical damage varying based on move power, and critical hits applying status effects alongside damage. Under one removed critical hit system, moves that matched the user's type would have significantly increased critical hit rates, creating situations where same type attack bonus would stack with critical damage for devastating attacks. This was deemed too powerful and removed in favor of the speed-based critical hit formula in the final game. Another cut mechanic allowed certain Pokémon to land guaranteed critical hits on the first move of battle, representing ambush tactics or surprise attacks. This was removed for creating frustrating situations where players would lose Pokémon before getting a chance to act, particularly against high-level opponents. The paralysis status condition had more severe effects in early builds, with paralyzed Pokémon having significantly reduced speed and higher chances of being fully paralyzed each turn. This was softened in the final version to make paralysis powerful but not completely debilitating, ensuring paralyzed Pokémon could still contribute to battles. Sleep mechanics were even more powerful in early versions than they ended up being in the final game, with some builds allowing sleeping Pokémon to sleep for unlimited turns until manually awakened. This infinite sleep was changed to the random duration system because the unlimited sleep effectively removed Pokémon from battle permanently unless the opponent chose to wake them. Burn damage originally reduced affected Pokémon's attack stat by half, while also dealing damage each turn, making it devastatingly effective against physical attackers. This was considered too punishing, and the attack reduction was made less severe in later balancing passes, though burn still remained one of the strongest status conditions. Freeze mechanics allowed frozen Pokémon to thaw randomly each turn in early builds, but this was removed to make freeze more consistent and terrifying. The final version's freeze mechanics, where Pokémon remained frozen indefinitely unless hit by fire moves, made freeze the most dangerous status condition in Generation 1. Poison damage scaling was tested, where poison would deal increasing damage each turn similar to toxic, but this was simplified to flat damage per turn for regular poison, with only toxic featuring escalating damage. This distinction made toxic feel more valuable and dangerous compared to regular poison. Confusion mechanics, where confused Pokémon might attack allies in double battles or target themselves with status moves, were designed but couldn't be implemented properly due to the lack of double battles in Generation 1. These confusion variants were shelved until later generations, when double battles made them feasible. Flinch mechanics that could chain across multiple turns if the opponent kept using priority moves were tested but deemed too frustrating and removed. The final version's flinch mechanics, where flinching only prevents action for a single turn, struck a better balance between being powerful and not completely locking down opponents. Cut Pokémon designs that never progressed beyond early concept sketches reveal the sheer volume of ideas that were generated during Generation 1's development, with designers creating far more Pokémon than could possibly fit in the final game. A seal Pokémon distinct from seal was designed based on harbor seals rather than sea lions, with a rounder, spotted design that differentiated it from seal's more streamlined appearance. This alternate seal was cut when designers decided having two different seal species in the same generation would be confusing and redundant. Multiple dragon-type designs beyond the Dratini line were conceptualized, including a Chinese-style serpentine dragon, a Western-style dragon with wings and 4 legs, and a dragon-dinosaur hybrid. These extra dragons were cut to keep dragon-type rare and special in Generation 1, with only the Dratini Evolutionary line and Aerodactyl's partial dragon theming representing draconic Pokémon. A dolphin Pokémon was designed and partially implemented before being cut, possibly due to concerns about dolphins' protected status and the sensitivity around depicting dolphins in games where creatures battle each other. This dolphin concept would resurface in later generations, with Pokémon like Lantern sharing some aquatic characteristics. Several additional bird Pokémon beyond Pidgey, Spearow, and far-fetched lines were designed for Kanto's skies, including a crow, an owl, a hummingbird, and a peacock. These extra birds were cut when designers realized the existing bird Pokémon already provided sufficient variety and that adding more would make bird types feel too common. A koala Pokémon clinging to a tree was designed as a grass or normal type, but this design was cut and wouldn't appear until later generations introduced Komala and Alola. The koala's slow, sleepy characterization might have overlapped too much with Slowpoke's delayed reactions, leading to its removal from Kanto. Multiple bug-type designs were created beyond those that made it to the final game, including a praying mantis distinct from Scyther, a dragonfly, a mosquito, and a scorpion. Some of these designs were cut because they were too similar to existing bug types, while others were deemed too creepy or intimidating for the game's intended audience. The mosquito design in particular was reportedly cut due to concerns about depicting disease-carrying insects in a positive light, as mosquitoes are associated with illness and are generally viewed as pests rather than interesting creatures worthy of becoming Pokémon. A mushroom Pokémon separate from Paras, and Parasect was designed, possibly a pure grass-type mushroom without the parasitic bug-type element. This standalone mushroom was cut when designers decided the parasitic mushroom concept in the Paras line was more interesting and unique than a straightforward mushroom Pokémon would be. Rock-type designs, including a living boulder that was more spherical than Geodude, a crystal cluster Pokémon, and a sandstone formation creature were all conceptualized but cut. The decision to limit rock types in Generation 1 meant only the most distinct and interesting rock designs survived to the final roster. A plant bulb Pokémon unrelated to Bulbasaur was designed as a pure grass type, possibly intended to be a common early-game grass Pokémon found in forests. This generic plant design was cut in favor of making grass types slightly rarer and more specialized, with most grass Pokémon in Kanto having distinct themes beyond just being plants. A snake. Pokémon separate from Icons was designed based on constrictors rather than cobras, featuring a thicker body and different pattern. This alternate snake was cut to avoid redundancy, with the Icons line keeping snake representation to a single evolutionary family in Generation 1. Water-type designs that didn't make the final cut included a clam that wasn't Shelder, a coral Pokémon, a sea urchin, and an otter. These aquatic creatures were cut when designers realized Generation 1 already had extensive water-type representation and that adding more would unbalance type distribution. The sea urchin design was reportedly quite far along in development, with spike-based move animations partially created before the Pokémon itself was cut. This spiky aquatic creature might have inspired later generation Pokémon with similar defensive designs. A rabbit Pokémon faster and more aggressive than Nidoran was designed but cut, possibly because the Nidoran lines already represented rabbit-like creatures, and having a third rabbit species would be excessive. This speedy rabbit concept might have influenced later generation designs like Buniri or Scorbunny. Ghost-type designs beyond Ghastly's evolutionary line were numerous, with ideas for haunted objects like possessed dolls, possessed armor, and possessed lanterns, all being conceptualized. These object-based ghosts were cut when designers decided that Generation 1's ghost types should feel more like traditional spirits and specters rather than haunted items. The possessed doll concept in particular was reportedly considered too creepy for the game's target age range, with concerns that young players would find dolls coming to life genuinely frightening rather than exciting to catch and train. Fighting type designs included a gorilla, a kangaroo that wasn't Kangaskhan, various martial artist humanoids, and a rhinoceros beetle. These fighting types were cut as designers narrowed down which fighting type archetypes to represent in Generation 1, ultimately keeping the ones that felt most distinct. Psychic type designs beyond those in the final game included a fortune teller Pokémon, a crystal ball creature, and several designs based on meditation and spiritual enlightenment. These were cut when designers decided that psychic types should remain relatively rare and powerful rather than having many representatives. The evolution stones themselves had unused variants in development, with some stones being designed but never implemented in the final game due to lack of Pokémon to use them. The Sunstone existed in concept during Generation 1's development years before being officially implemented in Generation 2. Early designs for Gloom's evolution into Blossom and other sun-powered evolutions were conceptualized but delayed when designers couldn't create enough compelling Sunstone evolutions to justify adding the stone to Generation 1. A Dusk Stone or Moon, shard item distinct from the Moonstone, was designed for evolving dark or ghost-type Pokémon, but with so few dark and ghost types in Generation 1, this stone had no purpose and was cut. The concept would eventually resurface in later generations when dark types became more common. An Eternal Stone, separate from the Everstone, was conceptualized, which would permanently lock a Pokémon's form and prevent all future evolution attempts even if the stone was removed. This extreme measure was cut for being unnecessarily punishing and offering no benefit over simply not evolving Pokémon normally. Metal Coat and Dragon Scale, which would later become evolution trigger items in Generation 2, existed in concept during Generation 1 as potential held items that would boost specific attack types. These items were delayed until Generation 2 when held item mechanics could be properly implemented. King's Rock similarly existed in early design documents as an item that would trigger evolution for specific Pokémon when traded, but the trade while holding mechanic couldn't be implemented until Generation 2's expanded item system allowed for it. Various elemental stones beyond fire, water, thunder, leaf, and moon were proposed, including Wind Stone, Ice Stone, Earth Stone, and Light Stone. These additional stones were cut to keep evolution methods simple and prevent players from becoming overwhelmed with too many evolution items to track and manage. The Windstone was meant to evolve flying-type Pokémon or bird species, but with most bird Pokémon in Generation 1 evolving through leveling, there weren't enough candidates to justify including the stone. This concept would eventually appear in later generations under different names. Ice Stone was designed for Ice-type evolutions, but was delayed because Generation 1 had very few pure Ice types that could benefit from Stone evolution. The abundance of Water-Ice dual types that already had clear evolution paths made Ice Stone redundant in Kanto's roster. A Chaos Stone or Random Stone that would trigger random evolutions or transformations was briefly conceptualized as a high-risk, high-reward item, but this randomness was deemed frustrating rather than exciting, and the concept was abandoned entirely. Regional differences in wild Pokémon availability were more pronounced in early development builds, with some version-exclusive Pokémon appearing in different locations across red and green versions, rather than being completely absent from one version. In early builds, Ekans appeared on certain routes in green version, while Sandshrew appeared on the same routes in red version, but both Pokémon could still be found elsewhere in both games, just at different rates. This was simplified to complete version exclusivity to make trading feel more necessary and valuable. Time of day exclusive Pokémon were planned for Generation 1, despite the lack of real-time clock functionality, with some Pokémon potentially appearing only if players had been playing for certain amounts of time or during specific gameplay sessions. This was cut when designers realized it would be confusing without visual indicators of time passing. Seasonal variants of Pokémon forms, where the same species might have different colors or slight design changes based on when they were caught, existed in concept but couldn't be implemented without seasonal tracking. This concept would eventually appear in Generation 5 with Deerling and Sawsbuck. Migration events where certain Pokémon would temporarily appear in unusual locations before moving on were designed as dynamic world elements, but the static nature of Game Boy cartridges made true migration impossible. All Pokémon distributions had to be fixed rather than changing over time. Evolution trade chains, where catching a Pokémon from one trainer would reveal a new Pokémon available from another trainer, were conceptualized as a network of NPC trades throughout Kanto. This was simplified to the straightforward in-game trades in the final version to avoid confusing players about trading prerequisites. Rarity tiers beyond just encounter rates were planned, with some Pokémon potentially having special requirements to make them appear like defeating certain numbers of trainers or catching specific Pokémon first. These unlock conditions were cut to keep wild encounters straightforward and based purely on location and luck. Shiny Pokémon existed in Generation 1's code, but weren't properly implemented as a visible mechanic until Generation 2, with the DVs that determine shininess being present but without any visual distinction. Some late development builds experimented with alternate colorations, but these were cut for cartridge space reasons. Weather-based encounter changes, where different Pokémon would appear in rain versus sunshine, existed in concept but couldn't be implemented without weather systems. This dynamic encounter mechanic would eventually appear in later generations with more advanced hardware. Swarm mechanics, where large groups of a single species would rarely appear, allowing players to catch many of the same Pokémon quickly, were designed but cut. This concept would later be implemented in Generation 3 with the Pokémon News feature announcing swarm outbreaks. The Pokédex itself underwent significant changes during development, with the early versions having more extensive features that were cut for simplicity or technical limitations. Height comparison features where players could see their captured Pokémon's size relative to the player character or other Pokémon were designed but cut due to graphical limitations. This visual comparison would eventually appear in later generations with better display technology. Weight-based sorting that would arrange Pokémon by mass rather than just by number was conceptualized but removed to keep the Pokédex interface simple and focused on numerical order. Later generations would add multiple sorting options. Habitat information showing exactly where each Pokémon could be found with encounter rates was planned for the Pokédex, but this was cut to preserve the mystery of finding rare Pokémon and encourage exploration rather than targeted hunting. Behavioral notes describing Pokémon personalities, preferred foods, and social structures existed in early Pokédex mockups, but were cut due to space limitations. The brief Pokédex entries in the final game represent condensed versions of much longer descriptions. Move history tracking that would show which moves a Pokémon had learned and forgotten was designed but removed for taking too much memory. Players had to manually track move changes or accept that forgotten moves were gone forever. Evolution tracking showing exactly which Pokémon in the player's collection had evolved from which others was conceptualized as a feature showing the player's journey with each Pokémon. This was cut as unnecessarily complex when the evolutionary lines were straightforward enough to understand without explicit tracking. Catch location data storing where each Pokémon was caught, existed in very early builds, but was removed to save memory per Pokémon entry. This feature wouldn't be properly implemented until later generations, with more storage capacity per Pokémon data structure. Stats comparison features, allowing direct comparison of stats between multiple Pokémon, were designed, but cut to keep the interface simple. Players had to manually compare stats by viewing each Pokémon individually. Nickname history, showing all previous nicknames a Pokémon had been given, existed in concept, but was cut as frivolous and memory intensive. Each Pokémon could only store its current nickname without preserving name change history. Battle history tracking wins, losses, and notable moments for each individual Pokémon was conceptualized as a way to build narrative around specific team members. This extensive tracking was cut for requiring too much data storage per Pokémon. The Pokémon storage system itself had several cut features that would have made PC box management more sophisticated than what appeared in the final game. Automatic sorting features that would arrange Pokémon by level, type, or alphabetically were designed but cut to keep the PC interface simple. Players had to manually organize their boxes in whatever order they preferred. Search functions, allowing players to quickly find specific Pokémon by name or type, were conceptualized but removed as unnecessary when box capacity was limited enough that manually browsing wasn't too tedious. Box labeling, allowing players to name each box with custom labels, was planned, but cut due to text entry limitations and memory concerns. Boxes remained numbered without custom naming options. Multiple save states for different teams or playstyles were conceptualized as a way to let players experiment without permanently altering their main save. This was cut when designers decided that meaningful choices required permanent consequences. Trading directly from PC boxes without withdrawing Pokémon to the party first was designed but removed due to technical complications with linking two Game Boys and accessing their respective PC systems simultaneously. Mass release functions, allowing players to release multiple Pokémon at once, were considered but cut due to concerns that players might accidentally release valuable Pokémon through misclicks or misunderstanding the interface. The medal and achievement systems that would later appear in various forms throughout the series had very early conceptual roots in Generation 1 before being cut entirely. Secret achievement, tracking for rare accomplishments like catching Pokémon with specific move combinations or defeating trainers in unusual ways, existed in design documents, but was cut for being too metagame focused. Badge case enhancements showing extended information about each gym leader and their specialties were designed but simplified to just displaying collected badges without additional context. Battle statistics tracking total battles fought, win rates, and most used Pokémon were conceptualized but cut for requiring extensive data storage and potentially making players feel judged for their battle performance. Collection milestones that would celebrate catching certain numbers of Pokémon or filling specific type categories existed in concept but were cut in favor of just the diploma for completing the Pokédex. Exploration milestones tracking distance traveled, trainers defeated, and locations visited were designed as a way to reward thorough players, but were cut for being difficult to display meaningfully within the Game Boy's interface limitations. The battle system's underlying mathematics underwent extensive refinement during development, with numerous formulas being tested and adjusted before the final damage calculations were established. Damage variance ranges were initially much wider in early builds, with the same attack potentially dealing vastly different damage on repeated uses. This randomness was reduced to make battles more predictable and strategic rather than relying heavily on luck. Critical hit damage multipliers were adjusted multiple times, with early versions featuring critical hits that dealt 3 times normal damage rather than the 2 times multiplier in the final version. This was reduced when testing showed that triple damage criticals could instantly knock out Pokémon that should have survived. Stat stage modification limits were initially unlimited in very early builds, allowing Pokémon to stack infinite stat boosts through moves like Swords Dance or Amnesia. The 6-stage cap was introduced to prevent battles from becoming one-sided stomps where boosted Pokémon became completely unstoppable. Accuracy and evasion formulas went through numerous iterations, with different approaches to how much each stage of accuracy or evasion modification would affect hit chances. The final formula represented a compromise between making evasion strategies viable without making them overly frustrating to fight against. Type effectiveness multipliers were originally more extreme, with super effective moves dealing 3 times damage and not very effective moves dealing only 1/4 damage. These multipliers were reduced to 2 times and 1/2 respectively to make type disadvantages more manageable and prevent certain matchups from being completely unwinnable. Priority move mechanics, where faster Pokémon would still attack first, even when using priority moves against slower opponents using normal moves, were tested, but changed to make priority absolute. This ensured that priority moves felt impactful and useful even for slow Pokémon. Weather Effects' impact on move power and accuracy was designed, but couldn't be properly tested without weather systems being implemented. These calculations existed in code, but went unused until Generation 2 introduced weather mechanics properly. Status move accuracy formulas were adjusted to make status-inflicting moves more reliable than they were in very early builds, where even moves like Thunder Wave could miss frequently. The final accuracy values represented balancing between status moves feeling consistent while not being completely guaranteed. These mathematical refinements happened largely invisibly to players, with the final formulas creating the battle system that defined Generation 1's strategic depth. Each adjustment represented careful consideration of how battles should feel and flow, with the goal of creating engaging combat that rewarded both preparation and an in-battle decision-making. The legacy of Generation 1's cut content extends far beyond just what was removed, as many cut concepts would resurface in later generations after being refined, reimagined, or adapted to better hardware capabilities. Ideas that were impossible or impractical in 1996 eventually became core features of later games. The experimentation visible in Generation 1's development files reveals a team willing to try bold ideas even when technical limitations made implementation unlikely. This creative ambition, combined with pragmatic willingness to cut features that didn't work, resulted in a focused, polished experience that defined Pokémon for decades to come. Every cut piece of content represents a decision made in service of the final game, with designers choosing quality over quantity and cohesion over completeness. The discipline to remove features, Pokémon, and systems that didn't serve the core experience allowed Generation 1 to shine as a revolutionary title, rather than becoming bogged down by half-implemented ideas. Understanding what was cut from Generation 1 provides context for appreciating what remained, showing how careful curation and difficult decisions shaped the original Pokémon adventure. The invisible computers, unused evolution stones, cut Pokémon designs, and removed mechanics all exist as quiet monuments to the creative process behind one of gaming's most influential franchises. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you.